there's been a lot of bad stuff happening in the crypto industry recently. You know, the two most notorious examples are the collapse of UST and now Celsius basically locking withdrawals for a few weeks now. Clearly, these two examples fit into a sort of gray area of regulation. I guess my question is what kind of regulation do you see coming most immediately, and what kind of regulation would specifically address those two examples?
Well, one, good morning, and thank you for having me. One of the words you just used was immediately, and Congress and immediately don't go together, right? And so I think the reality is you're much more likely to see something from the states in this space, because in many cases, some of the entities that I think you just named are licensed in various states. And so I think you're going to see state financial regulators step up first. And I would imagine that either A, some of these concerns are already addressed under existing law by virtue of their licenses, or B, you're going to see state legislators step up, where you may see certain liquidity requirements, for example, where, you know, what is it backed by and so forth as a condition of a license. So I think you're far more likely to see states be more active in this space than Washington. You'll hear a lot of talk from Washington, but I think you're unlikely to see regulation or actual law passed before you'll see states act on this.
So, I mean, that's an interesting point, but we've already seen some state action against Celsius, for example, right? Like Celsius was already on the radar of states. So this sort of raises a larger question, which is like, is regulation really the answer to this problem? Because you could say that like Celsius maybe knew, you know, had pretty strong signals that they were, you know, running into some legal problems, right? So would just having like kind of stronger straight state actions really address problems like that going forward?
I think in the short term, yes. I mean, if you ask regulators or policymakers if more regulation is the answer, I think their answer is they're going to say yes. I think the reality is this is still a market that's evolving, and I think most policymakers are still trying to learn it. But in terms of who can act faster and who can actually move faster, it's going to be a state regulator or a state legislator, right, as opposed to Congress or the SEC or the CFTC, for example. So I think in the short term, right, and I think obviously in the long term as well, there's a reason why we don't have the same liquidity issues with banks. Like, we have an entire system of deposit insurance and so forth and so on that protects people in the event of runs or people want to make withdrawals. That may be the long game, but I think in the short term, you'll see far more action around licensing. Because again, these entities in many cases were licensed, especially the exchanges and so forth in these states. So again, I think, you know, whether it's the long-term answer, I think that's a question that the jury is still out on. But what people will actually do in the short term is regulate.
I guess it's just, do you think it will help? I mean, I guess the larger question here is how much of the answer lies in regulation and how much of it lies in some sort of the crypto industry just doing a better job of kind of policing itself?
Well, I think a lot of the industry is going to be gone. So what we've had is kind of the gold rush phase. And I think you're going to have a lot of players shake out. Bankruptcy is going to shake out a few. Some are going to be acquired. Some are just going to go out of business. And so I think what you're going to end up having are the players who can afford the compliance, who probably have a far better system of what backs what they say they have. And again, I think you're going to have regulators primarily in the states, but I think the federal government will step up at some point, do a bit of both. So I think the future of this is some combination of all of the above. Do I think it's good? Yeah, I think to some extent, yes. I think to some extent, you probably do need some guardrails that address some of the investor concerns that if they put money in, they can get money out, right? And I think ultimately the industry should want to feel like they have confidence that no matter where they invest, that they're safe. And I think that's something that there's probably some shared interest in both industry players and regulators in ensuring that that happens.
Nonetheless, we are seeing states that, yes, are getting involved in regulations. We're seeing states like New York where people have complained that it's actually too onerous versus states like Wyoming, which is fairly open. Yet senators from each of those states came up with a proposal to try and sort of get the ball rolling with some amounts of crypto regulation or some amount of at least identifying these industries. And we also have, of course, major concerns in the financial sector when it comes to stablecoins particularly, and how it could affect the overall economic health or at least the markets. are we kind of seeing this point where states, as you said, they might respond quickly, but to the point that the federal government says, look, we have to act whether we like it or not because of the potential systemic risks that some stablecoins might provide down the road in the next 3 years, let's say?
So I think there are two things, right? When people say the federal government, there's Congress and there's the executive branch. The legislation you just referenced, we are in July, roughly, in terms of legislative days, just about. Congress goes out in recess in August. They're in election cycle. So I think I'm a fan of what we've seen from Lummis and Gillibrand. I think this is a great first start. But legislation still has to go through regular order. It has to go through various committees that will be referred to. It has to be marked up. Again, that isn't likely going to happen before the end of this year, right? Now, that being said, the regulation you're going to see from Washington is going to be largely through enforcement actions. So that's probably not what I think folks in the industry want to see. But again, there won't be, I think, a definitive legislative response from Congress to what we're seeing in the markets now this year. It's just a matter of legislative calendar, right? We simply don't have the days in the year to do the things that I think some people may want to see. What fills that gap is, I think, regulation by enforcement from federal regulators like CFTC, SEC, perhaps even the FTC or the CFPB, given some of the things I think we've seen in the marketplace of late. And then in addition to some of the state issues that I covered. So it's what the marketplace needs and what Congress's calendar says are probably two different things in this case.
Do you have any further insights? There's a number of applications next week for a Bitcoin spot ETF that are going to await a decision from the SEC. Do you have a temperature check on that? What are the possibilities of that being approved?
Hard to say, and I'd hate to get here and speculate. I would say that the timing is tough because I think if you ask the average senator, what do they think about what's going on? I think the news is probably tough because what they see are runs, they see liquidity concerns, they see layoffs from some firms that I think concerns people, and they see investors and complaints coming from many of their constituents. So the likelihood, it's tough to say, right? But I think the timing, is really difficult. But I think that will give us, a good signal on what to say. But again, I'd hate to speculate. We'll see. I think is the best answer that I have. But the timing is probably tough right now, just given what we're seeing in the marketplace.